Alright gamers, welcome. In this video, I am going to show you how you want to be blind picking on ADC. I'm going to tell you what are the best ADC blind picks, not just for when you have no information about anything at all, like if you're just blind, like literal first pick and champ select, but also if you at least have some information that also affects the viability of each choice. So we're going to go through this very in-depth, and so you can see just how good every ADC is blind pick, or just how bad it is to blind pick certain ADCs. So I based this video and all the lists on data available on Lolalytics. How did I decide what is a good blind pick or not based on data from Lolalytics? Well, we looked at the win rate delta per matchup on Lolalytics. So if we look at Fellows' page on Lolalytics here, well, here we sort by delta, and we're looking at delta 2 in particular here. So the delta in a champion's win rate in their matchups is basically so for a Vayne example, how much does a Fellows win on average? It's 48.18% for the record. And let's say Vayne wins 49.7% of the time. Well, relative to those champion performances, who actually wins? Not just in the sense of like, oh, Fellows is the lower win rate champ, so he has a negative win rate, so he has a bad matchup against Vayne. No, like accounting for the fact that they have each respective win rate, who comes out on top relative to who is expected to come out on top just based off of their win rate alone. So Fellows actually has a positive win rate against Vayne, even though his win rate is lower than Vayne, which you can see means that his delta is very high, because this is a very good matchup for Fellows. And then we have it against other matchups as well, where his win rate against certain champions may be negative, but the delta is high because that is so much higher than he would be expected to perform against that champion. And so we've done this for every matchup, and that is how we're going to be determining basically how good a blind pick every champion is. We'll go more in depth in that in a second though. So basically I took the highest delta each ADC has in their matchups and compared it to the lowest delta they have, and looked at how far apart their ceiling is from their floor. The distance between these two is what we're going to be calling the range in their deltas. The higher the range, the worse a blind pick they are, as their performance is very highly varied depending on what the opponents pick in response. So that's not a good blind, because the enemies can just counter you pretty hard. And then the smaller the range, the better a blind pick they are, as their performance varies less depending on their opponent's picks. So they can't really hard counter you because there is no hard counter available. You picked a champion who is not all that dependent on what the opponents pick. And so here are some considerations to keep in mind as we move forward through the video. Getting counterpicked by the enemy support matters just as much, if not more, than being counterpicked by the enemy ADC. Therefore, I've also looked at the range of their support matchup deltas, not just ADC versus ADC matchups. Additionally, ADC and support synergy impacts win rate just as much as opposing matchups do. So I've also looked at the range between ADC support synergy to find the ADCs who have minimal variability in their performance, depending on what support gets picked with them. In case you don't know what your support is yet and can't trust them to pick around you, because if you have a duo, maybe that's less important, but if you're playing solo queue, you have no idea what your support is going to pick, that's pretty important. You want to make sure that even if they troll pick you, the impact of the troll pick is minimal. Towards the end of the video, I will show you my 4 tier lists for ADC blind pickability, which is pure blind, no information on enemy ADC or support or your support. ADC blind, which is when you have no information on the enemy ADC, but you do at least know the support matchup and synergy is fine or good for the champion that you have in mind. Support blind, which is no information on enemy support, but you know the ADC matchup is fine or good, and support synergy is fine or good for the ADC you have in mind. And synergy blind, which is no information on what your support will pick, but you do at least know that the enemy matchup on both sides, on both picks, is fine or good. I've excluded many outliers from the range calculations for those ADCs for whom large outliers existed in their deltas. This is because if a pick has decent matchups into almost everything, but 1 or 2 horrific counter picks, it doesn't stop being a good blind pick if they won't face those awful matchups in the vast majority of their games anyway. When looking for good blind picks, we're looking for consistency across any period, and so we don't want the conclusions altered by picks that are not consistently played at all. Your opponents don't play every single champion, and so they're not going to pick your worst counter every single game. I decided which matchups to treat as outliers based on a mix of both how far away they were from a champion's performance and their average positive/negative win rate matchup, and also how frequently or infrequently they are picked. If only somewhat off but very rarely picked, they are treated as an outlier. If somewhat frequently picked but extremely off from other deltas, they were also treated as an outlier. If the delta was extremely high, but the pick rate was very high too, they were more likely to be kept in, as the high pick rate kept it closer to what you should expect on average, even if it is just one outlier. My decisions were overall highly subjective, and I can't promise my choices on what to exclude were something everyone will agree with, but I'm sure it is still overall much better than making no exclusions at all. In some cases, I also excluded some outliers that weren't that bad, simply because their low sample size give me low confidence in the accuracy of their delta, and so they just didn't simply feel worth including at all. You should expect to have bad matchups even when picking good blind picks. It's just that the matchups won't be that bad, and so their expected win rate into bad matchups is not that low. Then when you counterpick, when you have full information on both your support and the enemy support and the enemy ADC, you can pick a high range champion if the matchup fits and reap the rewards for their high expected win rate in that matchup. This way, you'll be maximizing your gains and minimizing your losses. This video won't cover exactly when you should pick each high range champion, which you should just think of as good counterpicks yet easily counterpicked, as it's only focused on every ADC's blind pickability, but you can expect something like this on a video in the future, I don't know when, at some point. The range system isn't a flawless way of calculating through stats which champions are good blind picks or not, but it's probably the closest way of measuring it without having to spend 100 times more hours on it. So, as an example, like really, if I wanted to do a perfect system of measuring through stats, which is always going to be somewhat flawed in itself, but you could, even through stats, you could do it a little bit better by actually having some sort of weighted system where you don't just look at the deltas, but also the pick frequency of each delta. But that's getting way too complicated and would take far too long, so we have to keep it simple. I still think, looking at the results, it has been a pretty good method, even if not perfect. The results in many cases are literally just exactly what I would have expected, so I think it's been fairly accurate. Also, when we're talking about good/blind picks, we are not referring to safety, or maximizing my ability to survive lane with low deaths if I happen to get a bad matchup. Rather, we are referring to minimizing my chances of getting a losing lane in the first place, even when blinding, and also maximizing the odds that my losing lanes are only slightly losing rather than brutally losing when getting counterpicked. So, for example, like when we're talking about good blind picks, we're not talking about, ooh, I have to pick blind here, so I'm going to pick something incredibly safe that doesn't die. Because that does not necessarily correlate with your ability to win that game. So, for example, Ezreal, which you might expect to be at the top of the list, he's fairly good, by the way, just not at the very top. He's kind of overrated as a blind pick because, he can survive very easily in any matchup. But the thing is, Ezreal is a strong early game champion who gets outscaled. Therefore, when you pick him, generally, you are looking to get a lead in lane. You are not hoping to just survive. So that means that there are properties he has that makes him good as a blind pick, but he is not just the perfect blind pick just because of how safe he is. Rather, what we would consider a good blind pick is, if I get counterpicked, I don't lose that hard. If I blind pick this ADC, there's a decent chance I won't even have a losing matchup anyway. And also, this ADC is going to synergize, is least likely to have really bad synergy with my support. Right? We're looking to maximize, like, if we're going to have a chance to lose the game, we want that chance to be minimal. Right? Because any counterpick is not going to be that big a counterpick. This champion does not have that bad matchups. This can mean we are picking an unsafe ADC. This means that if we lose lane, we might actually lose lane hard, but the chances of getting a lane where we lose hard are not going to be that high because this champion doesn't have that bad matchups, right? That's what we're looking for. We're looking for consistency in the long run, not just maximizing my chances of not inting any given lane, right? Which are two very different things. And also, for some context moving forward, the median range for ADC matchups is 2.17. The median range for support matchups is 3.36. and the median range for support synergy is 3.32. So the exact number here, this is basically, the range of the delta just basically means ADC matchups. If I pick an ADC and the enemy counterpicks with an ADC, on average, across all ADCs, the variability in the matchup, expected win rate in each matchup is like 2.17% win rate difference between your worst matchup and your best matchup. So if we take Aphelios, for example, and say he's exactly at this median, the difference between Aphelios' best ADC matchup and his worst ADC matchup, there's a 2.17% win rate difference between them. Then we look at his win rate difference between his worst support matchup and his best support matchup. The difference is 3.36%, and very similar also to his delta between his best support and his worst support when picked alongside him. So you can already see that the range for ADC matchups is actually far lower than the range for support matchups and also for support synergies. So counterpicking the enemy ADC or getting counterpicked by the enemy ADC is not really that important. You would much rather have information about what the enemy support is picking, and to a slightly lesser extent, but basically the same, you also want to know what your support is picking, or you want to ideally have some synergy with them, or if you're not going to have synergy with them, you want to minimize the impact of your lack of synergy. And so, personally, I would say that the range is significantly above the median are terrible blind picks, right? Because there's just too much variability there. Like if you get counterpicked or if your support picks bad synergy, that's going to lead to a drastically lower performance. But if the range is significantly above below the median, that means there is very minimal variability there, which means your pick is a very good blind pick. And then if you're just on the median, I would say that is a risky blind pick. It's not awful. You're going to see there are some picks that are very, very bad blind picks, and those on the median are significantly better in comparison, but they're still risky. There are much better blind picks out there. And that covers everything that I wanted to cover before we actually get into each ADC and before we get into the tier lists. But now we're going to get into the actual picks. So we're going to start off with Aphelios here. So you can see that the range of his matchups versus ADCs is 2.69, which is 24% higher than the median, which is significant. So Aphelios is very easily counterpicked by opposing ADCs compared to the average ADC. When you actually look at his matchups versus supports, he's actually 0% of the median. So he's not, relative to the average ADC, he's not that easily counterpicked by supports. But it's still important to note, the average ADC is still counterpicked a lot more heavily by supports than by ADCs. This is still true for Aphelios, right? So even though he's 0% of the median here, is still overall more significant than getting counterpicked by the enemy ADC. Then meanwhile, his support synergy is 2.82 or 15% lower than the median. So relative to the average ADC, what your support picks is not that important. What is a lot more significant is what the enemy support is picking, and also relative to other ADCs, it is super important what the enemy ADC is going to be picking. If we look at Ashe, this is already looking very promising. As you can see, this is all negative. So the range of her ADC matchups is 1.4, which is 35% lower than the median. The range of her support matchups is 2.96, or 12% lower than the median. And her support synergy range is 2.19, or 34% lower than the median. So yeah, Ashe is a very good blind pick. We're going to rate them more specifically later on, how they all compare to each other. But right off the bat, I can already tell you Ashe is definitely one of the best blind picks, because compared to other ADCs, especially her ADC matchups have so minimal variability in them. Whether you counterpick or get counterpicked, it only has a 1.4% win rate impact over your win rate, according to ADCs, which is nothing. Then meanwhile, for supports and support synergy, it's a little bit more significant at 2.96 and at 2.19. So, it's always going to matter to some extent. But when you're picking Ashe, you are minimizing, by far, the extent to which you can be counterpicked, even by your own support. So, very good. So for Caitlyn, the range is 2.09, or 4% lower than the median, basically at the median. Same for supports, is 3% higher than the median. And so when looking at our synergy with supports, it is 8% lower than the median. So very middle of the pack here, very slightly leaning more toward a good blind than a bad blind, but still there are much better blinds. Still, she is very strong in the meta right now, for example, so that is also something that we will account for a bit later on. We have actually 2 different tier lists for every category. We have just how strong each ADC is as a counter pick, or as a blind pick, sorry, if we are not taking account into their current balancing. And then we also have a separate tier list, which is like taking into account their current balancing. How much would I actually want to blind pick this ADC? Because there's no point picking a good blind pick who is horrible in the current meta, you know, where their stats are just all undertuned, their items suck, you know. You want to avoid those blind picks, so we'll account for that later on. Meanwhile, Draven. So Draven is about on the median is exactly the median actually for his ADC matchups, 2.17. Doesn't really matter too much for Draven. Like he does have some degree of counter picks. You know, there's still a lot of room to be significantly below the median, but it's not super important for Draven whether he gets counter picked by the enemy ADC or not. For supports, it really doesn't matter whether he gets counter picked. He actually has almost the same range for ADCs and support matchups, which is pretty crazy. So he actually, relative to other ADCs, he definitely cares more about getting counterpicked by the enemy ADC, but overall it's still about the same. Not taking into account relativity, but just looking at the champion itself, it's about the same for both. Meanwhile, support synergy is basically the biggest factor for Draven, is 3.4 compared to 2.23 and 2.17 here, and that's only 2% higher than the median, so this is fairly normal. Overall, Draven is a pretty good blind pick, mainly because he doesn't actually care what the enemy support picks. For these other 2 factors where it could be better, it's still not bad, so it's still fairly good as a blind pick. For Ezreal, we have the range being 2.14 against ADCs, 1% lower than the median. So similar to Draven, doesn't care too much about what he's playing against an ADC, although it does still matter a little. Versus supports, we have him being 6% lower than the median, so not huge, but does definitely care a little bit less than the average ADC about whether he gets counterpicked by the enemy support. And then for support synergy, we have him being 9% lower than the median, which also means that relative to the average ADC, he doesn't care all that much about whether his support picks for synergy with him or not. So you can see these are all pretty good, right? Like, he doesn't have any situation where he's worse than average. But at the same time, we've also seen in Ashe, for example, that you can get much better numbers than these. Also, I did write a note here because there's some room for, like, misleading here. The range for support matchups is actually very misleading, which is this is somewhat misleading, because there are only 4 supports he visibly performs terribly against. Sona, Rakan, Soraka, and Yuumi, most of which are heavy scalers with high sustain to nullify his poke. In the case of Rakan, he's probably just annoyingly hard to hit skill shots on due to his mobility. But if we treat as all 4 of these as outliers, his next lowest delta is only minus 0.96, as opposed to being minus 2.08 on Yuumi. That's a pretty huge difference. So if we were to treat all 4 of these as outliers, it would lower his range to 2.42, which is huge. That would be... did I write? No, I didn't unfortunately write exactly where that would be relative to the median. But it would be really good. It would mean that he can't actually really be counterpicked that much by the enemy support. That being said, it obviously wouldn't really make sense to just completely ignore his worst matchups just because they're significantly... Just because they're really, really bad compared to the average matchup. I mean, the combined pick rate is 6.67%. That is a decent pick rate. It's not... You're not going to face them every game, though. But it's the same pick rate as Thresh, which is a pretty popular support, you know? So you could just assume that Ezreal is an amazing blind pick with only a 7% chance to be counterpicked fairly strongly by the enemy support. Mainly, you should just avoid picking him if any of these supports are already picked, otherwise you can feel free to blind him. So this is one case, for example, Where, like I said, a weighted system where we're actually accounting for the pick rate of each support would be really useful. Because in this case, my system has Ezreal's rating being severely held back by the fact that he has 4 really brutal counter picks that are not actually super common. Like they're so far above the rest of them, but they're too common for really to be me counting them as outliers. But it paints a picture about him being easily counterpicked or like very commonly counterpicked, which is not really true. But unfortunately, I haven't devised a weighted system. That would take forever. So yeah, just consider that Ezreal is probably significantly better than I've really counted him. But there are some really bad counterpicks. You know, if the enemies were counterpicking you every single game, it would be really easy to just counterpick Ezreal every time. And like I said, he's going to survive the lane, sure. But, you know, Sona gonna heal his poke while hard outscaling him. Soraka gonna heal his poke while hard outscaling him. Yuumi gonna shield and heal his poke while again hard outscaling him. If you pick Ezreal into any of these 3, then you are basically expecting to go even in lane or even lose lane while also getting outscaled. So that's why Ezreal is just not a good blind pick in these situations. And then Rakan, I don't think it's about the healing or shielding. I think it's literally just about the fact that level 6 Rakan is very hard to hit with skill shots and fights. Anyway, moving on to Jhin. So Jhin, the range versus ADCs is 3% lower than the median. The range versus supports is 18% higher than the median. And the range in his support synergies is 11% lower than the median, so this is a fairly decent overall. That certainly, again, though, we've seen better. For Jinx, the range in her ADC matchups is 21% lower than the median. And the range in her support matchups is 19% lower than the median, and her support synergy is 48% lower than the median. So for Jinx, it really does not matter. It obviously matters to some extent, but relative to other DCs, it barely matters at all what support you have. She works with almost anything. And then when it comes to what she faces in supports, also doesn't matter all that much relative to other picks. And again, versus ADCs, just doesn't really matter much what you face. So when you look at why this could be the case, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious. Jinx has a very high range, so she bullies lower range ADCs, but also she has really good self-peeling with her E and her strong-ass W slow. Her range makes it easy for her to not have to get too close to danger. So really, she's kind of a pick that there's just not too much room to counter her. So that makes sense why she would just work with almost anything. And also when you look at the support synergy, well, she works really well with poke supports, for example, because she has really high range to play around their poke. If she's paired with an engaged support, she can take their lockdown, place her traps under the CC target. She can use her W on the CC target. She can use the traps with W with ult combo. She works with anything, whether you're playing with an enchanter, scaling for late game, whether you're playing with a poke mage for early game, whether you're playing with an engaged support for early game. She can work with all those playstyles, you know? So she is just very, very flexible, makes her an amazing blind pick. Now, is she as safe as Ezreal, for example? No, of course not. But like we've said, it's just the ability to be a good blind pick is not just about how much you can survive bad matchups. It's also about preventing the matchups being bad in the first place. You know, that is the most significant factor. When we look at Kai'Sa, we can see that she has a delta or range versus ADCs being 8% higher than the median. Her range versus supports is 27% lower than the median. And support synergy is 21% lower than the median. So you can see here the ranges of all these 3 is actually very similar to each other. They're all in the range of like 2.3, 2.4, 2.6. So Kai'Sa is one of the picks where it actually just really doesn't matter much at all. Like you don't look at any single one of these factors. They're all about equally significant. And relative to other ADCs, she cares a little bit more about the ADC matchup, but still not that much. And whether she gets counterpicked or not by the enemy support or her support also just doesn't really matter that much relative to other DCs. She's very good blind. So if, for example, if you already see the ADC matchup and you see it and you're like, oh, Kai'Sa's good into this matchup, and you have no information on what the enemy support has picked, you have no information or is going to pick, and you have no information on what your support is going to pick, but you at least know the enemy ADC matchup is good for Kai'Sa, then you already know Kai'Sa is a good blind because she's fine with these other factors. right? So that's one of the things that we're going to be, you know, one of the tier lists is basically going to be based on that. Like, do we already see the enemy ADC? Oh, then Kai'Sa's a good blind, assuming the matchup is good for Kai'Sa. So for Kalista, we have her being the range against ADCs 17% higher than the median. The range versus supports is 5% higher than the median. And support synergy is 17% higher than the median. So this is not like brutally bad, but all of these are definitely higher than the median in every regard. So not an amazing counter pick. That being said, what support she faces, not that important relatively. It's more about support synergy. Like, this is the factor she overall cares about the most. If we don't focus on actual like relative to the median, but just look at the total number, 3.87 range here. So what support she has with her is the most important factor. A little bit lower on the list is what the enemy support is, although again less significant compared to other ADCs. And then the least significant factor, even though it is also higher than the average ADC, is what ADC she plays against. So for Kog'Maw, is range versus ADCs we have as 13% higher than the median. His range against supports is 8% lower than the median. And his range with support synergy is 14% lower than the median. I wasn't sure about this. This is the point on the list where I was questioning myself, like, are these calculations just useless? Are they actually just really far from reality? Have I actually just wasted my time making this list? Is it actually just these numbers don't mean anything? Because I was sure that probably Braum and Lulu would be like way at the top, and that his range here should actually be a lot higher. But I think I'm probably just gonna have to accept that my pre-existing conclusion was actually just the one that was wrong here. Because if you look at Kog'Maw's win rate with other ADCs, unfortunately I already closed the tab. But if you look at his win rate with other supports, it's not actually, like, he has a positive win rate with everything. With everything. If you think Kog'Maw is only viable because he's always picked with Lulu, well, he is always picked with Lulu, but he also has a great win rate even with picked with everything else as well. His two highest win rates, his two highest deltas at least, are with Braum and Lulu, but he's not super dependent on them. They are the best, but he's not dependent on only them to be viable. So actually, his range in support synergy actually lower than average, as it turns out. Which I guess makes sense. I mean, he has a lot of ability to farm from a distance, so he's actually somewhat safe, while also always outscaling, unlike Ezreal. He, I guess, plays decently with poke lanes, especially after level 6. And I guess against Engage, he's not the worst. I would say it's probably his worst stuff, but yeah, I mean, I guess you've got the E to follow up with, the slow, can run them down with your W. I guess if you get locked down against the Kog'Maw, you are just going to get melted down, right? But anyway, regardless, he does have some ability to get countered by the enemy support, although that is still lower than the median. And relative to other DCs, he does care about getting counterpicked, but it's still overall the smallest factor. So overall, what you would really like to avoid as Kog'Maw really is just getting counterpicked by the enemy support. That is definitely the biggest factor here. Although overall, still actually surprisingly not that bad a blind pick. Still, I would say is about average though. Not great, just average. Meanwhile, we have Lucian. The range for his ADC matchups is 18% lower than the median, so he really doesn't care all that much about who he faces. But he actually isn't that great at blind pick, because if we continue moving forwards, range versus supports, 9% lower than the median. But his range with supports, synergy, is 48% of the median. This is actually I highlighted this because it's actually really funny. His best delta, if we exclude outliers, is 1.71 with Melio. So when playing with Melio, he has a 1.71% higher chance of winning the game, taking no other factors into account, just what his support is. But then the outlier that is Yuumi, he has 8.23% higher than expected chances of winning the game when he is playing with Yuumi, which is absolutely insane. That is the highest delta that I know of any ADC with support. These are just the two best synergizing support ADC duos. But because Yuumi is actually not that commonly played with Lucian, which is somewhat popular, like some people know that they have crazy synergy together, but it's not like Zeri Yuumi where people tend to duo on those picks, or people tend to lock in Yuumi after they see their ADC lock it in. I guess it probably because it gets taken up a lot by Nami. People tend to prefer Lucian Nami because they have a better lane. But anyway, like, basically, this is a crazy outlier, and overall, even when we take Yuumi out of the equation, it's still probably really affecting his range, because when we look at his negative deltas, those are kind of like taking into account the fact that he is really good with Yuumi, right? Basically, because the deltas work off of average expected performance, Yuumi is part of his average expected performance. We've excluded this as an outlier because otherwise the number would be absolutely extreme and not actually that accurate. But at the same time, she's still impacting this list because she's dragging down the deltas of every other pick. And so even when we take Yuumi out of the equation, he is significantly higher above the median. So by far, the biggest impact in picking Lucian, the biggest factor to take into account is whether you have synergy with your support. Everything else, by comparison, extremely insignificant, especially the ADC matchup. So for Miss Fortune, the range of her ADC matchups is 12% lower than the median. Versus supports, it's 25% lower than the median. I probably should be saying the actual range, but I know there's so many numbers here. And the range of her support synergy is 3.8, 14% higher than the median. So you can see, biggest factor here is support synergy, which is what I would have said, so nice. I know that Miss Fortune loves lockdown supports. Turns out whether she gets counterpicked with enemy support or not really that important, especially compared to other ADCs. It's more about the support synergy. ADC matchup, again, not that important. So if you already know that your support is picking a lockdown support, then you already know Miss Fortune is a great pick, regardless of what the enemies pick. There's probably just one exception to that the stats don't account for, and that is Miss Fortune's best supports are all countered by Morgana. So if the enemies have Morgana, and you know that your support's win condition is countered by Morgana, and you know your support's win condition is where the synergy between these two lies, then okay, Miss Fortune won't actually be that great a pick. But otherwise, with that one exception, because Morgana just has that one really weird ability that flips around these matchups. Aside from that, she would always be a great blind with these supports. Again, I haven't actually said which supports they are. That's for another video, another time. So Nilah, spoiler alert, she is by far the worst blind pick. On average. There are some situations, like if you at least know one of these factors, maybe she's not the absolute worst. But yeah, so the range of her ADC matchups is 4.01. Bear in mind, the median is like 2.20 something or 60 something, I don't remember. This is well above that average, 85% higher than the median. That is crazy. It really matters to Nilah whether she is counterpicking or getting counterpicked. And that is even though I made a lot of exclusions that were so much worse than her actual worst matchup. Mainly, she does terrible into mages. Any mage, doesn't even matter which mage, any mage, she is horrible into them. Fortunately for her, mages are not that popular. Even if you do blind pick Nilah, chances are the enemy won't pick a mage, even though that would be a free win for them. But even excluding that, she's still a terrible blind pick. So, but she's, in theory, like, if people would pick properly, she is an even worse blind pick than I'm indicating here, right? She should be like 120% higher than the median. Fortunately, we don't live in that world, so it's not as bad as it could be if you're a Nilah enthusiast. So the range of her support matchups is 5.08, or 51% higher than the median. So as much as she cares about the range of her ADC matchups, the range of her support matchups is actually even bigger. And then for support synergy, it's 4.76 or 43% higher than the median. So relative to other ADCs, she cares a lot about what support she's paired with, which is one thing that makes her blind. But that is a very tiny factor even when compared to, or not very tiny, but it's even still a smaller factor than getting counterpick on the enemy support. This is by far the biggest factor on Nilah, or it is the biggest factor on Nilah anyway, maybe not by far. But counterpicking the enemy support is the biggest factor, or at least not getting counterpicked. And But really, all of these factors are very, very big, especially when compared to other ADCs. So she's a terrible blind. That being said, if you're going to pick one factor where you see that is at least accounted for, and you're like, fuck it, I'm going to pick Neela. Like, if you get counterpick on the enemy support, for example, and you know the support matchup is amazing, then you can at least be comforted knowing that even if the worst case scenario happens and you get hard countered by the ADC and hard countered by your own support, which sadly, yes, does happen very frequently, then at the very least, you have the hard counter on the enemy support somewhat compensating for that. But if you're picking completely blind, it is really bad because of how bad that can go. For Samira, the range in her ADC matchups is 3.23, or 49% of median. 49% higher than the median, sorry. The range in her support matchups is 3.77, 12% higher than the median. I really should have got some water before starting this video, goddammit. My voice is getting dry. And the range in her support synergies is 6.7, or 102% higher than the median. So basically Neela and Samira and also Miss Fortune, they were what like comforted me and were like, you know what? Now this list actually clearly does have merit to it. I was worried about the Kog'Maw thing. But like I very much know that Samira, Miss Fortune, and Neela are very dependent on those very particular factors. And the stats do in fact show that they are extremely dependent on those factors. So it's what tells me like, yeah, okay, you know what, this does have a lot of good basis to it. Thank God. Thank God I didn't waste those 12 hours making this goddamn list. But yeah, so for Samira, by far, and in this case, it really is absolutely by far the one single biggest factor for picking Samira is whether you are going to be counterpicked by your own support or not. She does care a little bit more than others about the ADC matchup, but even this number is still less than half of the factor that the support synergy is. So if you already, so it's similar to Miss Fortune, except even more so true, where if you already know that your support is something that is good with Neela, like Nautilus, Samira, not Neela, then it is almost certainly going to be a good Samira game. There's some room to get counterpicked there if you get countered by the support and also counterpicked by the ADC. But it is really, like, it's probably impossible to actually make it a bad matchup. It's just going to be not as good as it could have been. Whereas if you blind when you don't know where your support is, that can go very, very wrong. Because there are some picks that are extremely bad with Samira. So overall, terrible blind pick. But if you at least know the support thing is going for you, that is already good enough. You can blind the rest of the factors. It doesn't matter. Minimal versus Sivir. Okay, I'm gonna go get some water. I'll just edit this part out of the video if I remember. Be right back. Oh my god, much better. Alright. So, the range of Sivir's ADC matchups is 2.35, which is 8% higher than the median. The range of her support matchups is 3.96, so 18% higher than the median. And the range of her support synergy is 2.37, which is 29% lower than the median. So in this case, it is actually one of those unique cases where the one of the support factors, which is, you know, the enemy support or your support, one of those, in this case, your support factor, is actually almost as insignificant as whether you get counterpicked by the enemy ADC or not. What is actually really important for her is whether she gets counterpicked by the enemy support or not. Sorry, I just had some water. Now I'm burping. It's still not that bad when she gets counterpicked by the enemy support, but there's some room. One factor I noticed when I was looking at her deltas is actually she seems to perform quite bad into enchanters. I'm gonna guess that they either shield or sustain all of her poke, which to be fair is pretty telegraphed. The Q travel time is forever. It is super easy to block that with a shield. So it seems to be that for how weak she is in lane, she can't really cope with all of her damage getting blocked, because that just makes her even more obscenely weaker, right? Whereas she tends to perform quite well against everything else. Engage supports, mages, all good. Basically, just so long as they have an ability that she can block with her E, she's going to be fine. But enchanters typically don't have anything useful to block with her E, and also they block all of her poke, so she tends to be really bad in those matchups. But otherwise, like if you can tell that the support matchup is good for a Sivir, she's already going to be quite a decent blind. For Smolder, the range of his ADC matchups is 1.74, so 20% lower than the median. Doesn't really care. The range of his support matchups is actually 5.15, 53% higher than the median. And his support synergy range is 3.32, or 0% of the median. 0% higher than the median, sorry. 0% would be literally 0. So yeah, so he doesn't actually care too much about what champion he plays against, but something that is super significant for Smolder is the support matchup. Now, why is this? Actually, I can tell you through first-hand experience, Smolder loves playing against supports who get in his face. Why? Because he gets to stack on them. I don't know how many of you realize this, but Smolder ideally should not be getting all of his stacks through farm. He does not want passive AFK farming lanes, because the potential for stacks in those lanes is very small compared to lanes where he is permanently fighting and getting to cast Q, W, E, Q, Q, auto, Q, W, Q onto some fat fucking tanky support who is going to give him a billion stacks in each fight, you know? I've had Smolder games where I get stomped in lane and have like 5 CS a minute, but my stacks are really high because while I'm getting my shit kicked in, I'm at least constantly hitting the enemy's support with abilities, and I'm getting stacks from it. Meanwhile, I've had games where I've had 10 CS a minute at like 20 minutes into the game, and almost all of those lost hits are with my Q. And then I look at my stacks and I'm like, huh, my stacks are pretty low this game. I'm just not fighting. And so what you want to face, again, is just supports that get into your face. You want to avoid, as you can guess through Ashe, supports that just play from a distance. You don't want to face mages. You ideally would rather not face enchanters. You don't want to face you know, something like Ashe, which just push from a mile away. I don't know what you'd call Ashe, but ADC support, whatever. But Smolder really wants to face something that will actually fight him. Which sounds contrary because he's a hyperscaler. It sounds really backwards. It sounds like he would just want to AFK farm. Not the case though. The main thing is that you want to be able to stack a lot in lane. If you can stack a lot in lane, then he's really good. And as you can see from the massive Braum outlier, if it is something that you can hit a lot in lane, but also that support is really bad at actually killing you, then that is a tremendously good matchup for Smolder. Unfortunately, most melee supports are engaged supports, which do have high kill potential. Despite the high kill potential, they're still good for Smolder. But if it can be a melee that doesn't have kill potential, like Braum, then that is an amazing matchup. And yeah, that is by far just the most significant factor. Everything else doesn't matter too much, although the support synergy still matters a lot more than the ADC matchup. For Tristana, we have the range in ADC matchups being 2.32, or 7% higher than the median. I think I can just stop talking about the median. You guys can read. I'll just talk about the actual number. Against supports, the range is 2.3, and against supports, against your support, shall we say, the range is 3.33. So by far the biggest factor is going to be what your support is picking. Is the most important factor for Tristana. I don't, like off the top of my head, I know she's pretty good with some enchanters, and is okay with engaged supports as well, obviously. Is probably quite bad with mages. Obviously I don't have a comprehensive list prepared for you though, but if that's something you want to look into or ask around about, that's fine. But if you already know what Tristana is good with on support, then yeah, you can make use of that information and know that, oh, if I already know what my support is and I know it's good with Tristana, then she's actually quite a good blind pick, because like most ADCs, she doesn't really care too much about what her ADC matchup is, and she actually just does not really give a fuck what the enemy support is. I do know from experience that generally you would rather not face CC in lane against Tristana. You don't want to get locked down when you place your bomb on someone, because then it robs you of the opportunity to actually fully stack the bomb, which can be a pretty big deal. But even that is just very insignificant compared to the actual factor of your support. Because generally otherwise, like, she literally is the engage. So she brings engage against mages who are weak to engage. And she's not vulnerable to all-ins because of her W, so she's good against engage supports. She will stomp the shit out of enchanters for sure, so, you know, it just doesn't really matter. For Twitch, the range in his ADC matchups is 2.77. The range in his support matchups is 3.36. And the range in his support synergy is 5.21. So, yeah, Twitch is one of the ADCs that by far cares the most about what his support is picking. So, good to blind if you already know your support is good with Twitch. Although still not amazing because he actually does have some quite bad ADC matchups. And also bear in mind, just because, like, it could be that the ideal support for Twitch, for example, is, well, you know, Yuumi is really good with Twitch, right? And obviously Lulu is really good with Twitch, was like the most famous duo before Yuumi came out. But these two also have distinct weaknesses, right? Yuumi is weak to engage, Lulu is weak to engage. So just because you know that your support has picked something good with Twitch does not necessarily always mean that it's a good Twitch Lulu or Twitch Yuumi angle, right? Because if Yuumi is weak to engage, and you pick Twitch with Yuumi, and you're also weak to engage, and then the enemies pick engage, your bot lane is counterpicked. Right? You also have to account for what counterpicks your support. Right? Which unfortunately gets really complicated. But just know that, like, if you already know that your support is Yuumi, then basically the only thing that can go wrong is the enemy picking engage, right? That's the one thing that can go wrong. And in many other cases where, you know, it's the same story for another ADC where they're really dependent on support synergy, it's still usually going to be a good blind if you already know your support is going to be good with your champion. But there's still room for that to go wrong, right? Your support can be counterpicked. And it could be that even though you don't care too much about what the enemy support is picking, like here, 0% of median, it could be that Yumi's median against other supports is actually very high, right? So there's a lot of factors to take into consideration there. But obviously, for this list, we got to keep it somewhat simple, because honestly, we could be here forever if we talked about in depth every single little factor there is. It's just not viable. So Varus wrote a note about this, which we'll get to in a sec. His range in ADC matchups is 1.72. His range versus supports is 3.06, and his range in support synergy is 2.82. So fairly decent blind. Doesn't care much at all about what his ADC matchup is. Not too affected by what his support picks, and is also not too affected by what the enemy's support picks, although that is overall the biggest factor. The note here, though, is that this one really has to be taken with a grain of salt, because the stats are not really like fully accurate as to Varus's viability as a blind pick, because there are two very different Varus playstyles, right? There's on-hit Varus and lethality Varus, which are DPS and poke, which are two entire... It's like the difference between picking Ziggs ADC and Kog'Maw ADC, you know? Like, one is a poke champion, one is a DPS champion. You can't compare them. But Varus is both. Like, he can pick which one he's going to play in champ select. You have not actually picked what style of champion you are playing until you decide your rune page, right? And so because those playstyles have entirely different strengths and weaknesses, like, he's actually a very good blind pick. So 70% of Varus players play on hit, so that is what is most directly affecting the data. So this mostly is relevant to on hit Varus, but also there will also be some lethality Varus bleeding into it as well and affecting the results. So this is not perfectly accurate as to DPS Varus even. But additionally, even if these numbers were perfectly accurate for DPS Varus, he's still a lot better blind pick than that, because you can just pivot to lethality if necessary. You know, you can just see the matchup and decide in champ select whether lethality or on hit is going to be better for the matchup. So, like, just bear that in mind. This is not a champion where you can actually calculate through stats how good he is as a blind pick, because you'd basically be after calculating for two different champions. And there was just not nearly enough, unfortunately, sample size for me to bother separating them into two. So I just had to write this caveat. So for Vayne, the range of her ADC matchups is 2.54. The range of her support matchups is 3.44, and the range of her support synergy is 3.6. So relative to other ADCs, it doesn't matter too much whether she gets kind of picked by the enemy support or not, or what support she's paired with. Although it is still like higher than average, just not by much. But really what is more significant for her compared to other ADCs is her support matchup. She does care about the the ADC matchup. She cares a little bit more about the ADC matchup compared to the average ADC. Overall though, what she would care about the most is a little bit, basically support synergy is slightly the highest. And then versus, like whether she gets countered by the enemy support or not is the second highest. And overall, basically for most ADCs, the ADC matchup is going to be the least significant factor. In some cases, it'll just barely be the same as one of these other factors, but in no case is it ever really going to be the highest. It just doesn't really work that way for one way or another, for one reason or another. So for Xayah, the range of her ADC matchups is 2.07. The range versus support matchups is 4.64. And the range for her support synergy is 2.81. So Xayah likes a little bit to play with lockdown supports. You can see here Blitzcrank, for example. She's also good with like Nautilus, probably Pike, probably Rel. Basically any lockdown support she is good with. But it's not like Samira and Misfortune where she is like super dependent on them. Actually, what is much more significant for Xayah is the enemy support. What she really wants is to face a melee support, because melee supports have to get in there, and when I'm talking about get in there, I have to mean like she's placed a ton of feathers behind them, and instead of running away from the feathers, they have to keep moving forwards to do anything at all. That sucks for them, because they're going to get massively chunked by the Xayah feathers, and there's no way around it except not engaging on Xayah. So she is a hard counter to engage supports. That is the biggest factor for her by far. And meanwhile, very high range picks like Vel'Koz, you know, basically just mage supports in general, and also to a lesser extent, I'm sure, enchanters. Xayah is not going to be great against those, because there's just, she can poke them with like QE, but the chances of actually getting a root, let alone a root with like 6 or 7 feathers, it's just not going to happen. So she is missing out on a lot of damage in those matchups. So super support matchup dependent. And as for ADCs, you know, just about average, a little bit below. Again, like most ADCs, doesn't really care about it. So for Zeri, the range in her ADC matchups is 2.21. The range in her support matchups is 3.23. And so the range in her support synergy is 7.96, which is 140% higher than the median. We'll just read the note here together. It's hard to measure Zeri's range properly because with 13% pick rate together, it is impossible to separate Yumi's impact over Zeri's win rate. We can't just shove Yumi aside as an outlier when she is directly responsible for a large portion of Zeri's win rate, which therefore makes the delta range much wider than if Yumi didn't exist. Her mere existence forces Zeri to be a niche pick. Just for the record though, if we were to exclude Yumi as an outlier, her next best delta would be Rakan at 0.9, making her range 2.74, or 17% lower than the median, implying Zeri doesn't care what her support is, which is very clearly wrong. She is very dependent on her support pick. It's just that she is very dependent on that support being very specifically Yumi, in most cases. Also, in case you're confused about why she has such a huge delta against Xayah, which we haven't really been pointing out, but if we look at the best delta she has in the support matchups, she just randomly has a 2.4% higher win rate against Xayah than against like Braum, for example. Her best support matchup, best popular support matchup that isn't Xayah. Why is that so dramatically higher? Well, that is because Xayah plans to get one-shot by single target abilities, and Zeri's right-click is treated as a single target ability, even if it is not charged. So Zeri's uncharged right-click is supposed to do like, what, 7 damage? But it just one-shots Xayah plants. You might have thought like, oh, because she can Q auto the plants to one-shot them. No, she can straight up auto them and one-shot them. She doesn't need Q. The completely uncharged passive just one-shots them. It's very unfair. But a very fun matchup for the Zeri. Not so much for the Zyra. But hang on, we only covered really the support synergy. Yeah, so she doesn't really care too much about... thing is, it's hard to say whether she actually really doesn't care about the ADC matchup much, or whether she really doesn't care too much about the support matchup. It could just be like, she is so dependent on Yuumi being her support that her win rate is it just makes the impact of everything else very insignificant in comparison. Whereas like, so long as she has Yuumi, she is highly expected to win. If she doesn't have Yuumi, she is highly expected to lose, and it just makes all of these factors seem insignificant even if they're not actually. But hard to say. Basically though, yeah, super support dependent. Obviously you would much rather that support be Yuumi, but there's still some other decent ones, I'm sure. Like Lulu is probably okay, Braum probably okay. But you would much rather have Yuumi. Okay, so for Ziggs, the range in his ADC matchups is 3.43. The range in his support matchups is 4.92. And the range in his support synergy is 4.12. So all of these are actually significantly above the median. So if you thought Ziggs was a good blind pick, not really. Why is that? Well, I do know that he really likes having lockdown supports. Ziggs skill shots are actually infamously hard to land. Particularly in fights. Like if you're just trying to poke in lane, if the enemy sees something really short range, for example, that if I want to loss at a melee, and to do that I have to stand next to my casters, well then it's easy, right? He just throws the bomb on my casters, and it explodes immediately, and I get hit by that, no chance to dodge. But say I'm playing Caitlyn, and I can stand away from my casters. Now Ziggs has to rely on his bomb bouncing once, you know, let me get the camera. Bouncing once to land on me the second time. That is extremely hard to land, right? So Ziggs is actually very dependent on his support bringing lockdown so that he can very consistently land his abilities in lockdown, especially against, in fights. Especially against longer range ADCs where he would be dependent on 1 or even 2 bounces. And so therefore supports that don't offer lockdown, which Lux actually kind of does, but I'm guessing he just doesn't really work all that well with mages. He just really prefers lockdown supports. Meanwhile, he actually also cares a lot about what he's facing in the support role. So I don't know too much about this, but I'm gonna assume Pyke in particular is pretty bad because he's an engaged support. So, and Ziggs would probably rather avoid getting engaged on, I would imagine. 2, he's very slippery, hard to hit skill shots on. 3, has sustain. So that's like 3 different factors that would make that bad. In general, I'm going to assume he probably likes playing against enchanters because they just can't reach him. They can try and shield some of the poke, sure, but it's not as telegraphed as Silver Q, right? That you don't have as much time to block a Ziggs bomb. But even better would be the picks that don't have shielding, like Renata, for example, whose shield is quite weak and very hard to actually use on her ADC just to block poke. But yeah, I mean, again, I'm no expert here. I didn't really look in depth at every single specific scenario of which supports are ideal with each pick, because that would be a topic for another video. And I don't play Ziggs, so it's not something I've looked into before. But also, definitely one thing I can tell you, though, is he actually also cares a lot more about his ADC matchup, because there are a lot of ADC... Like, Kai'Sa, for example, is his worst matchup, because she can all-in him so easily, right? She can just ult behind him, and now if he wants to try and use his W as an escape, well, where's he running to? Like, Kai'Sa's turret? Like, he wants to sit back and poke, right? So he wants to avoid engage, hence the Pyke. He also probably would rather avoid stuff like Blitzcrank, Nautilus, whatever. So he wants to avoid facing engage. So Kai'Sa's one of the worst ones. Tristana would also be pretty bad, although maybe he can cancel her W. Maybe that works, I don't know. But what he would rather face is just low-range, immobile ADCs who can't poke him back because they can't reach him, but they also can't engage onto him because they don't have engage. So that's creating a pretty big delta here. Or the range, creating a pretty big range in the deltas. Anyway, so that is actually, we're finally done just exploring every single range in every single category for every single ADC. Only took us about an hour, awesome. Now, actually, it was more like 50 minutes because I've spent about 12 on the intro, but whatever. Anyway, so now we actually get to the tier lists. So we're going to start off with the pure blind tier list. This is You have no information of anything whatsoever. You don't know what your support is picking. You don't know what the enemy support is picking. You don't know what the enemy ADC is picking. You are just blind pick. The enemy, either you are the first pick of the champ select, or the enemies have only just picked their jungle or something, and you have no idea what else is coming. So, in this case, the best blind picks in S tier are going to be Jinx, Ashe, and Varus. Varus, if we just look at on-hit Varus, he would probably be more like A tier, which is still good, but he's just not on the level of Jinx and Ashe. But again, like I said, stats don't really tell the full story with Varus. So I call him S tier because he has that flexibility. If on-hit Varus is countered by something that counters DPS, then he'll just go poke, you know? Like, there's no winning champ select against Varus. The only thing that holds Varus back is the fact that he is, unfortunately, weak. So that's why in the adjusted for meta one, he's actually at the bottom of A tier. Like, he's probably intentionally kept weak because of pro play, because of that flexibility. Because really, I think it is stupidly unfair that you can't, like, that he always gets counterpick retroactively, you know? Like, that's a bad design. So, I mean, it just does make sense to keep him on the weaker side, right? Anyway, in A tier, then we have Kai'Sa, Draven, Tristana, Misfortune, and Ezreal. Then B tier, we have Caitlyn, Kog'Maw, Sivir, Jhin, Aphelios. In C tier, we have Xayah, Lucian, Vayne, Smolder. In D tier, we have Twitch, Kalista, Ziggs, and Zeri. And then H tier, which stands for Horror tier, we have Samira and Nilah. I'm gonna drink some water real quick. Much better. And now adjusted for meta. We haven't adjusted for meta for every single one of these categories because, I mean, like I said, I don't want to bait you into picking Varus just to blind because you know he's a good blind pick if actually Varus is quite weak. And also other ADCs who are maybe fundamentally or like stylistically not actually that good blind, but are actually very strong in the meta. So there's great incentive to pick them. We also might want to rank them up. So in the adjusted for meta tier list, we just have Ashe and Jinx at the top. I didn't think any of the others were worth bringing up. But we have Kai'Sa, Ezreal, Caitlyn, Jhin, Draven, Misfortune, and Varus in A tier. In B tier, we have Kog'Maw, Sivir, Tristana, and Aphelios. In C tier, we have Xayah, Vayne, Smolder, Lucian, and Ziggs. In D tier, we have Twitch, Kalista, Zeri, and Nilah. And in Horror tier, we have Samira. So fortunately, because Nilah is insanely busted, even though she is super dependent on, a lot of factors for whether she's a good pick or not, fortunately for her, it's more easy for her to get a horrifically good counterpick than for her to get a horrifically bad, being horrifically bad counterpicked, you know? Which means that realistically, relative to her strength, she is closer to D tier in practice than H tier on paper, where she actually should be if this was a completely balanced game. But meanwhile, Samira is like closer to actually being balanced. I don't know exactly where I'd say her balancing is, but it seems about right. So she stays exactly in H tier, exactly where she should be. Next we have ADC Blind. So this is my recommended lists for when you don't know what the enemy ADC is picking, but you do at least know that the enemy support matchup and that your support synergy is going to be okay for any one of these, right? So if we already know, for example, that we have a decent support for Ashe and that we have a decent support matchup for Ashe, then she would be good even if you had to blind pick against the enemy ADCs. So, I mean, this is realistically, it's not going to look all that much different to this list, right? Because this is already the smallest factor anyway. But yeah, here it is. So S tier, we're going to have Ashe, Jinx, Varus, and Smolder. Because remember, Smolder was one of the guys that cared the most about what the enemy support was and not really at all about what the enemy ADC is. So yeah, he's S tier in this category. Then A tier, we have Lucian, Misfortune, Xayah, and Caitlyn. B tier, we have Jhin, Ezreal, Draven, Zeri, Tristana, Kai'Sa, and Sivir. C tier, we have Kog'Maw, Kalista, Vayne, Aphelios, Twitch. D tier, we have Samira and Ziggs. And then horror tier, we still have Nilah. Because it is a huge difference for Nilah, whether she is facing a very high range ADC with CC, with dashes to escape her ultimate, or whether she is facing a very low range ADC, where any time they try to auto attack her, she can Q them back, and also dodge all of their auto attacks, and also dash onto them to destroy them right in their face, and also dash onto them to ult them, and absolutely demolish them while not being touched back because they're permanently CC'd and can't hit her back. You know, whether she gets counterpick or not, huge factor for her. Of course, though, when we're adjusting for the meta, the adjusted tier list is Ashe, Jinx, Caitlyn, and Misfortune. Caitlyn, for example, goes way up because she doesn't really care too much about the ADC matchup, and also she is just very strong right now. Then A tier, we have Xayah, Jhin, Varus, Smolder, Kai'Sa, and Sivir. Smolder is just actually not amazing on the ADC role at the moment, maybe a little bit better on mid lane. So, realistically, it's still not that great. Still decent if you have to blind pick, you know, A tier. So long as you already know the other factors, but yeah, just not S tier. Because of his strength in the current meta. And then B tier, Lucian, Ezreal, Draven, and Kog'Maw. For C tier, we have Aphelios, Zeri, Tristana, and Vayne. Then for D tier, we have Kalista, Twitch, Samira, Ziggs, and Nilah. Of course, Nilah, once again, just moving her up from horror tier to D tier because she's very strong. And therefore, because there's nothing in horror tier, well, there's no horror tier. Not for the adjusted for meta tier list. Again, because this is the smallest factor, there's just less room for something to be completely terrible in this category, right? Okay, and next we have support blind, which is we know that the support synergy is okay or good, and we know that the enemy ADC matchup is okay or good. So in that circumstance, for S tier, we have Draven, Tristana, Kai'Sa, and Misfortune. If you remember, I mentioned that Draven doesn't really care about any of those factors, but I think I do recall that the biggest one presumably was the enemy support, was it? Oh, no, yeah, no. Like he just doesn't care at all what the enemy support picks. Like he actually cares more about the ADC matchup and also his support synergy. So if those are accounted for, then yeah, he doesn't give a fuck what the enemy support picks. He's gonna stump them all anyway. Like realistically, like if he's facing poke, well, let's see, he's got sustain. He has some movement speed to dodge their skill shots. When I say he's got sustain, he builds Vamp Scepter, right? So he doesn't care. He can even dodge their skill shots extremely easily with his W. He can try and run them down to all in them. So he has some form of engage, especially with his E. So he's good against poke. Is he bad against melees? Well, let's see. He can dodge their engage fairly easily with his W. He'll straight up kill them if they try to engage on him because he's a pretty scary dude. He's got some self-peel through his E. Okay, so he's okay against engage, I guess. So what about enchanters? Well, he just fucking stomps them, doesn't he? Like, I don't even need to explain that one. They sure can't survive a Draven lane. So, yeah, Draven S tier. Alongside Tristana, Kai'Sa, Misfortune. And then for A tier, we have Jinx, Ashe, Varus, Lucian, Kog'Maw, Ezreal. And for B tier, we have Zeri, Twitch, Aphelios, Vayne, Kit. There's two Aphelioses here. Sorry, I just love him so much, guys. You have no idea. It's just hard to stop. I can't get him out of my mind. Vayne, Caitlyn, Kalista. And for C tier, we have Samira, Sivir, Jhin. And for D tier, we have Xayah, Ziggs, Nilah, Smolder. If there was two Aphelioses there, I might have actually forgotten one. 1, 2, 3, 4. 19, 20, 21, 22. No, 23. Okay, so I had 24. I know there's 23 ADCs on this list if you count Ziggs. So that was actually 24 with Aphelios, the double Aphelios. So that's fine. Anyway, then adjusted for meta. because at least for low elo, Draven is a little bit on the weaker side. I don't know how high elo players feel about him at the moment, but Draven certainly has been in much better states before, at least for low elo. So he's dropped down to A tier. Meanwhile, the new S tier is Kai'Sa, Misfortune, Kog'Maw, Ezreal. Kog'Maw, I think, is very strong right now. As mentioned, he has a positive win rate with almost any support you could think of. I don't know, like I know people constantly think Kog'Maw is a bad ADC and his win rate is inflated because people just duo queue with Lulu all the time. That is not what stats say. And they also think that, oh, it's just that the only people that play Kog'Maw are one tricks. Again, not what stats say. According to stats, Kog'Maw is not exactly very popular among casuals, but of the player base that he has, you know, let's say the player base is this size. I can't put this at the camera properly. Well, 70% of that is casuals. The remaining 30% are mains, or, you know, whatever the number is. It's actually very normal. Like, if instead of being this size, let's say that Kai'Sa's player base is this size. And again, the ratio is the same. 70% casuals, 30% mains. Kog'Maw's ratio is no different there. So he is not inflated by being only played by one tricks. He is not inflated by only playing with Lulu and Braum or whatever. He's not inflated by only being used as a counter pick or anything. There are genuinely people just spamming Kog'Maw out there, doing very well. And they have been for a long time. That has been the case for a long time. Kog'Maw is good. People don't want to believe it, but he is. Meanwhile, A tier we have Draven, Tristana, Jinx, Ashe, Varus, Caitlyn. B tier we have Lucian, Aphelios, Vayne, Sivir, Jhin. C tier we have Zeri, Twitch. Why does it autocorrect me Zeri but not anything else? Oh, because it thinks I meant 0, dumbass. Twitch, Kalista, Samira, Nila, Ziggs. And D tier we have Xayah and Smolder. So yeah. And finally, we have the final tier list. My god, it's an hour and 12 minutes. I had a feeling this would be a long one. Thank god it's finally over, almost. So for Synergy Blind, this is where we don't know what our support is picking, but we already know everything about the enemy matchup. We know their ADC, we know their support, and we know that this is going to be a decent or good matchup for any one of these ADCs. How good are any one of these ADCs blind when we already know the enemy matchup, but not what our support is picking? So, for S tier, we have Jinx, Ashe, Sivir, and Kai'Sa. For A tier, we have Aphelios, Varus, Xayah, Kog'Maw, Jhin, Ezreal, Caitlyn. For B tier, we have Smolder, Tristana, Draven, and Vayne. For C tier, we have Misfortune, Kalista, Ziggs. For D tier, we have Nila, Lucian, and Twitch. And for H tier, or horror tier, we have Samira and Zeri. So then, adjusted for the meta, looks like the S tier didn't actually change much here. So it's still actually Jinx, Ashe, Sivir, Kai'Sa. There are a little bit of changes though, I think, overall. A tier for this one is Kog'Maw, Jhin, Caitlyn, Aphelios, Xayah, Ezreal. Also, for the record, I did vaguely order these in order of like what I consider to be the strongest of A tier and the weakest of A tier, for example. It's not like super well thought out, but generally I do expect the top of A tier to be weaker than the stronger, sorry, than the bottom of A tier. Then for B tier, we have Varus, Draven, Vayne, Ziggs. For C tier, we have Smolder, Misfortune, and Nila. For D tier, we have Kalista, Lucian, and Twitch. And then for horror tier, we have Samira and Zeri. Do not blind Samira and Zeri, especially Samira, if you don't know what the hell your support is going to be. Yeah, okay, that is everything. That is the end of this 30-page document, which took me about 12 hours yesterday to compile before I finally went to sleep at 1 a.m. I was going to record it as well, but again, this has been a very long video, so I didn't really have time. Still should be able to upload it today anyway. Yeah, okay, so I hope you guys found this helpful. I certainly really hope so, because again, this took me forever to compile. Personally, I thought it was very useful. This has actually been very useful information for me. I already knew some of this. And in some cases, it just confirmed what I already knew, like Nila, really dependent on the enemy support kind of pick. Samira, really dependent on your own support. But it taught me a lot about some of the conditions of other ADCs where they weren't such extreme outliers, so like their ideal circumstances weren't as obvious. So yeah, I found it helpful. I hope you guys did too. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more educational ADC content, and I'll see you guys in the next video, I hope. Holy shit, guys, this whole time I completely forgot I still had some unfinished coffee.